So, sewage treatment plants, if you ask someone like me, are things of beauty.
Okay.
They'll take black water, grey water, treat it, separate the things that we call pollutants or what we're now trying to frame as nutrients, and really make it usable again so that we're able to take that water and recycle it, either at the building scale where the used water is produced or at the city scale, and sometimes in places like Bangalore, between cities, between the urban and the peri-urban areas.
Right.
If you're in a sewered area, then yes, it goes to your underground drainage network, which eventually has an outfall or it eventually ends up in the STP. If you live in an unsewered area or in, say, rural areas, then you have something called a septic tank, which your mixed water, which is your mixed used water, which is your black and grey together, go and end up there. Whoever's listening, if you know where your STP is located, I'd call you pretty aware.
Welcome to the Well Lab show, where we try to learn more about water, environment, land, and livelihoods. I'm Pavan Srinath. Every 2 weeks, we'll sit with some of our colleagues at Well Labs or talk to some of our wonderful partners and learn more about the science, the systems, and the stories around complex environmental and social issues. Let's get started. I'm Pavan Srinath. I work at Well Labs, and today joining me, I think for our first recording, I don't know if this will be the first episode that will be on our channel, but for the first recording is Deepthi Nagappa. Deepthi, welcome.
Thank you, Pavan.
So Deepthi is a senior research associate in the urban water program at Well Labs. Deepthi, you're by background an environmental engineer.
Yes.
Okay. So you work on sewer treatment plant designs, how do they work, and a lot of other things. And I think even for many of us in the organization who work on different topics, these sewage treatment plants are these black box, right? They're these either things that magically work or magically don't work. Bunch of wastewater goes in, something happens at the end of it. We hear things about carbon and nitrogen and other things. And what I'm trying to do is just get to the basics of it, right? So Deepi, just start us off. Let's not worry about industries and all the effluents that come out of industries today. Help me understand in our houses, when we flush the toilets, when we have use water in various ways, what exits our homes?
What exits is really two streams of wastewater or used water, the preferred term nowadays. One stream is grey water, which comes from the water we use in our sinks, in our showers, in washing machines. So that one. And the other is black water, which really is anything that's flushed on the toilet. So that can include excreta, urine, and some amount of menstrual blood.
Okay, so help me understand this a little better. So everything that is not coming directly from our toilets and from our flushes, right? You have, I'm guessing in our kitchens, we have some food waste, some extra chutney or sambar that's there that will get, flushed down the sink. You have everything from our washing machine loads, which I think in general, there's a lot of soap, detergent, other things. So what all does this gray water have? Like what's there in the water?
So, like you said, products we use when we're performing these activities like washing our vegetables, washing our hands, so soaps, detergents, hand washes. We also have, like you said, some amount of food waste that goes down the drain, some oils that we sort of tend to end up putting down the sinks. And we also have a little bit of dead skin cells, especially when we take showers or we wash hands, and some amount
And
of
whatever
bacteria.
dirt is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And on the other end, from what essentially gets flushed down toilets, you have far more noxious things, right?
Yes.
You pee and poop, some menstrual blood, but also people flushing all kinds of other things which they should not be flushing, right? Starting from toilet paper, but also going to pads, condoms, whatever that people want to get rid of
Essentially, yes.
quietly.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's not clogging up the drains, but that's again a different conversation. But so this is sort of the physical sort of elements that are there. Can you give us a little bit of sense of what's there in it? Like, so say you take pee and poop and bodily waste, what ends up in water? How do you sort of characterize it?
So, with the physical stuff, we also look at some amount of solids that remain, right? Especially in our poop. In terms of the chemical compositions, when you look at something like urine, you have a large composition of it being urea, which is a form of nitrogen. You have a significant amount of phosphorus that goes in there, and some amount of potassium that you see. A little bit of salts also go in just because of our consumption patterns. In terms of excreta, you have a lot of it again being solids, but volatile. That are volatile in nature.
Okay.
Some amount of fiber, some lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. So all of this.
So everything that we are not able to digest, or
Yes.
everything that is a byproduct or an end product of the digestion.
Yes.
Okay. So it's organic matter, right? So bunch of carbon, bunch of
Nitrogen, a bit of phosphorus in it.
So where's this phosphorus coming from? Carbon and nitrogen, I understand, right? Cell and proteins, and rest is hydrogen and oxygen, which we
Yes.
just there along with it. Where does the phosphorus come from?
So a large chunk of it comes from our urine. It also comes from the detergents that we use. So some of it in the black water comes in from the urine. Some of it comes from in the grey water comes from the detergents.
And when you said that they're volatile, it's that they don't sit by themselves, right? That's why things smell,
Yes.
gases leak,
Yeah.
things degrade
Yeah.
on their own as well, right?
Yeah.
The other sort of question I have is, so we think of, things like, oh, there's magnesium that we need to take as a supplement, or, something else. So when we're talking about things like phosphorus, are you talking about like micronutrients and so on that are there, or are they bigger?
They are slightly bigger. So something like magnesium or selenium, they are micronutrients that are required for our bodily functions. Stuff like nitrogen and phosphorus, those are really required for at the cellular level.
Right.
Things like, say, the production of energy, say something like an ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate.
Yes.
Requires the presence of phosphorus for its conversion, for its utilization, for respiration in us, and even for metabolic activities.
So we often think about carbon and nitrogen more, but phosphorus is there all along.
It is.
And it also exits
Yes.
with our waste.
Yeah.
Okay. And comes from soaps.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All of this is hopefully exiting our homes in some manner. What happens to them then? Do they all end up in these sewage treatment plants that then get fixed?
I think that's an incredible scenario. Unfortunately, that's not what happens all the time, at least. So it really depends on where you stay. If you're in a sewered area, then yes, it goes to your underground drainage network, which eventually has an outfall or it eventually ends up in the STP. If you live in an unsewered area or in, say, rural areas, then you have something called a septic tank, which your mixed water, which is your mixed used water, which is your black and grey together, go and end up there.
So what is the septic tank? I've seen these sort of pits being dug and they'll be concretized or covered in some way. But how do they stay without overfilling for years at a time sometimes?
So septic tanks are what we call on-site containment systems. Now they're largely used for storing the waste on site, which is different from treating it. So when we're storing it, there are some reactions that take place.
Okay.
Some leaching that happens depending on whether the septic tank is lined or not. So you have the water leaching into the soil, into the groundwater, but the solids remain. And they undergo reactions in which a certain amount of the volume is reduced, a certain amount of the composition changes a little bit, but they're not entirely treated and they're not safe to handle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one thing that we did not explicitly talk about is, along with all these nutrients and solids and liquids and things like that,
Yes.
there's a lot of bacteria, there's a lot of pathogens.
Yes.
What I think a lot of people may not also know is that a bacteria like E. coli, Escherichia coli, not the same as a bacterium that actively causes diseases in humans, right? Like, its objective is not to infect humans, but if we ingest it, if we drink things with contaminated with E. coli, they opportunistically cause a lot of harm.
Yes.
So, okay, so we need to keep them aside. So you're saying that some of these bacteria continue to survive in these septic tanks and do some digestion, and
Yes.
some stuff happens.
Yeah.
And I guess you have to clean these septic tanks occasionally.
You do. So there's also a difference in the way it happens. So in the top layer where you have some amount of oxygen, you do see a lot more aerobic activity. They use
Microbes
oxygen,
that use oxygen,
yeah,
okay, versus microbes that don't.
which is where anaerobic digestion happens, which is slightly further down in
Okay,
at the bottom of the septic tank mostly.
okay. So the septic tank is one, but at least the waste is being contained in some place and hopefully then evacuated safely.
Yeah.
And then rest of it flows down, I don't know, our canals, our kalways.
Essentially, they end up in our stormwater drains, which again end up in our lakes.
Okay. I understand that there are these harmful bacteria that we don't want entering our lakes, but what happens if your phosphorus or carbon or nitrogen ends up in a lake. Is that the worst thing?
It is pretty bad if you consider it from a lake health point of view.
Okay.
Now, like how nitrogen is phosphorus is important for us, for our bodily functions, the same is true when it comes to aquatic plants. It's also useful for their plant growth. And when you have a certain amount of it, like the amount that the plants are able to uptake use for their growth, it's great. It's an essential nutrient. But when the amount essentially exceeds what the plants are able to take, or when it exceeds the concentration at which it's able to degrade in the water body itself, again, opportunistic plants like algae that's blooming, or a large amount of plants grow, which is called a macrophyte bloom.
Right. So this is what is also eutrophication?
Yes.
Okay. So water sort of gets contaminated with
Get
the thing.
contaminated, and in this process, the dissolved oxygen in the lake also goes down, which is not great.
So
And
any fish,
fish
other
is-
thing all die.
yeah.
Okay. So obviously we need to now treat all of this for various reasons. And so we'll get to how these sewage treatment plants actually work. Liking the episode so far? Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and check out more episodes of the Well Lab show. And hey, share this episode with a friend, a colleague, a student, or a fellow environmental enthusiast who might find this episode useful. We hope to reach more great people like you. So, Deepthi, tell me how these sewage treatment plants work and tell me a little bit about the kind and the sizes of the plants that exist in Bangalore.
So, sewage treatment plants, if you ask someone like me, are things of beauty.
Okay.
They'll take black water, grey water, treat it, separate the things that we call pollutants, or what we're now trying to frame as nutrients, and really make it usable again so that we're able to take that water and recycle it, either at the building scale where the used water is produced, or at the city scale, and sometimes in places like Bangalore, between cities, between the urban and the peri-urban areas.
Right. So, you're calling all of these things nutrients, but they're just wastes, right?
The thing is, conception of them as wastes has come in because we haven't really had enough methods, or we didn't know enough of what we can do with them. But practices on the ground where, say for example, farmers downstream have been using untreated sewage for a long time to be able to grow their crops, for example, and the need to recycle and recover, say for example, the volumes of water we use, or benefits that accompany that process of recovery, say the nutrients, whether it's phosphorus, which is useful, which is anyway we need to remove.
But Deepthi, I had a follow-up question first on we keep calling them nutrients even though they have come out from human waste and essentially we can't use them again. They're our byproducts, right? So in what sense do you look at them as nutrients?
The nutrients, once we're able to recover some portion of them, they're also nutrients for the treatment process itself. Say, for example, farmers downstream have been using it to condition their soils, their crops to grow it. In the other case, they act as nutrients for the bacteria themselves in STPs so that the treatment process takes place properly.
So things like fertilizers which might have potash and so on, they're trying to serve sort of a similar need sometimes. So the nutrients in wastewater can be a source for agriculture.
Yeah.
Okay. Now water enters the sewage treatment plant. You're saying that small ones to big ones. What kind of sizes are we talking about? Like what would a small sewage treatment plant be able to handle versus a large one?
So, we talk about the volumes of water in units called kiloliters.
Sure.
And we measure how much goes and gets treated, its capacity, in terms of the volume of water, in terms of kiloliters per day.
Okay.
So, you look at a small STP, say in a city like Bangalore, it's at a 50 kiloliters per day capacity.
Okay.
The larger ones really go up to, which is a kilo, which is 10 to the power 3, go up to a million liters, which is 10 to the power 6.
Okay.
So the ones that are more centralized in nature, I mean, we know, for example, the Jakur is 15 million liters per day.
From what I understand, we go up to maybe not 100 million liters per day, but something between, I think, 30 and 60 or
Yes.
30 and 70.
Yeah.
So just to get my metrics right, when we talk about human sort of water supply and the norm is about 150 liters per person per day,
Give or take.
I think the well-off in Bangalore consume more than that. So 200, 250. We don't know the exact number. So what that means is if you're talking at the smallest level, 50,000 liters, So what we are essentially saying is about 250 people perhaps,
Yes, yeah,
roughly,
yeah.
right? So then that's another by 5. So maybe about 50 households or so,
Yes.
right? So we're talking at that 50 to 100 households and then bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, there's some other math there that we don't need to get into. So all this water comes in
Yeah.
to various sizes. What's sort of the common, let's not get into the design of every single thing right now, but what happens to the wastewater or the used water, black and gray, once it comes in?
So we first want to remove things that are floating.
Okay.
Right. The approach we generally take is to go from the bigger ones, the bigger pollutants, to the smaller ones.
Okay.
So you go from the macro to the micro. So the bigger ones, the floating particles or the floating substances, any matter that's there, we remove it through screening. So bar screens are installed at the entrance of the sewage treatment plant.
Okay.
After that, we have a sedimentation tank which has an oil skimmer on top of it. So you want to remove any sort of oil and grease that's coming in the wastewater, say from sources like kitchens and canteens in commercial establishments. And you also want to be able to settle the larger particles that you can settle very easily with gravity. All of this you also do because after these steps follows a main reactor, and you don't want any of these substances going into it because it's not great for the bacteria who do the work of treating it to be able to carry out their functions.
So whatever is there in water that can settle out of water, get it out first.
Get it out, yes.
Okay. Do we do anything like, say, there are some whatever solids that are remaining from human waste and other things, and we get them to settle down in
Yes.
these tanks? Is that done? Like, we need to treat that stuff still, right?
We do. So there are still some substances that are dissolved in the water itself and some that are in suspension. And all of this, so you have a fraction that's settling, but the supernatant, the water fraction that's on top, then goes to an aerobic or an anaerobic reactor.
Okay. But what about what settles down?
So what settles down is called primary sludge, and that is again like how we do with our septic tanks. That's also removed through, say, vacuum suckers or honeysuckers.
Okay. So they should also be sort of treated and handled in
Yeah,
their own way.
yeah.
Okay. And then so we settle out what we can, and then what do we do with the rest of the whatever's still in liquid?
So this is where the main biological treatment comes in. Like we've already discussed, there are two main ways of going about doing it. One is where we introduce oxygen, where we give air supply. So the bacteria have oxygen. They also have from the waste itself a carbon source as a source of energy, really, for them to carry out their metabolic activities, for respiration. Then they're able to treat, and depending on how we sort of size the tank, we zone it. Sometimes it's not a cutthroat aerobic or anaerobic, but you can also create zones within each tank to have these anaerobic, maybe anoxic, which is some amount of oxygen, and then an aerobic zone. So you're able to then play with different levels of oxygen, which then supports the growth of different types of microbes, which correspond to whichever type of contaminant you're looking to remove. So something like this is great if you want to look at removing carbon, which is the main thing we want to do, but also to remove nitrogen in the same process. Phosphorus doesn't really work in a similar manner,
Okay.
and we do it in a later stage.
Okay. So you're saying basically instead of having just things like E. coli, you consciously deploy other bacteria,
Yes. Yep.
which then digest
Yes.
the stuff in water
Yes.
in whatever way they can.
Yes.
So if you have this carbon and nitrogen in water, what do these various stages, whether they're using oxygen or not, what do they end up making with the nutrients or the waste that are there in water?
So if you have air introduced, an aerobic reactor, then you end up with carbon dioxide and water. And if you have processes where you're trying to denitrify, which is remove the nitrogen, then you could end up with another greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide. And
Right.
if you don't have oxygen, which is anaerobic reactor, then you end up with greenhouse gases like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and some amount of biomass as well.
Okay. And all of these bacteria are just swimming around, or like, do they have like their own mass and volume, or like?
They do. When we look at an entire treatment process, we're really trying to optimize the amount of bacteria that's there in the reactor tank itself. So sometimes what we do, the bacteria that's already grown, so it takes time, you introduce it in the tank, the bacteria use the carbon source, nitrogen source, and they start growing in population. They multiply essentially. And that's called bulking sludge. So we want to take that out, we want to remove it, but later when we do remove it, we want to introduce some amount back, which is essentially to recirculate some amount of it so that we maintain this optimum dose of microbes that are present in the water itself to treat whatever is incoming.
Okay. And you said sludge. So the bacteria is swimming around in solution, or are they?
It is in solution, and later when we go after this main reactor bit, we have another sedimentation tank or a settling tank where this biomass is then allowed to settle again.
So these are not bacteria just like how we might see under a microscope, right? I mean, I've heard vaguely of things like biofilms and so on. These have a lot of substance.
Yes. So you have certain bacteria that correspond to the nutrients itself. Say, for example, for phosphorus, you have phosphate oxidizing bacteria. I mean, we don't have to go into it, but it's interesting that you brought up the biofilms. A lot of the times in specific configurations, say, for example, where biofilms are formed, which is really a film of these bacteria on any sort of substrate or any sort of carrier material. So it can be in membranes, it can be in small, tiny plastic pods that we use. And all of this, again, is to essentially help remove these contaminants.
Is it sort of like plaque?
It is, yeah.
Like you have bacteria that might be swimming in blood,
Yes.
but then you have these bacterial buildups even over something like our tape
Yes, which is
within a day,
yeah.
within whatever. So the idea is that instead of a millimeter thin layer, you can have.
You can, but it also then sloughs off after a certain point. So you
Right,
do,
and then you let it settle down. You get rid of things that way.
yes, yeah.
Okay, so you can treat carbon and nitrogen reasonably well, pull it out of water, or get it out as gases.
Yes.
Some gases being worse than others. But you're saying phosphorus can't quite be handled by this?
Yes, so phosphorus doesn't really convert into any gaseous form. So we need to settle it as particles. And what we do in the later stage is to add coagulants like alum, for example, which is great to bind with the phosphate that's there, and then it settles as secondary sludge. So primary before the reactor and secondary after.
So now all of this happens. So you're managing not just the solids and other things, but also the nutrients that are there in water. And assume that, okay, we're getting a bunch of this out.
Yes.
What happens next with the water?
So after that, we really want to remove the finer particles that are there. So once it's settled, there are still some in suspension, the finer ones, that we filter out. We use two stages of filtration. One is the pressure sand filter. Essentially, it goes through different layers of sand, going from the finer sand to gravel. And then after that, once that's done, we pass it through an activated carbon filter to remove anything else, to remove odor, some amount of color. And then after that, we disinfect. So that's either through chlorination or through UV or a combination of both.
So this would be what? Secondary treatment?
If you do the filtration, then that's tertiary.
Okay.
If you do it up until the reactor and you can still disinfect at that point, so then that's secondary.
Okay. And the idea is that after tertiary treatment, the water becomes good enough to drink, or?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay.
We still need to do some amount of RO treatment, and depending on the source water, say for example, you have a lot of salts because we use borewell water, right?
Right.
You would still need to maybe have an exchange resin, so you remove the salts, so you get RO filter. You also would need to have more focus on the disinfection here if you want to drink it. So have UV and chlorination, and you'd also ideally like to blend it with fresh water. So when you say use it for drinking, it's really what we call direct potable reuse, and that's something that's generally not done as a practice. Typically, it's blended with a portion of fresh water as well. So you're really augmenting a portion of your freshwater demand by using treated water.
So you do this treatment as much as you can based on what kind of end use you want, or
Absolutely.
whether it's for drinking, whether to let into a lake or to flow down the rivers, etc. Okay. The science seems complicated, but from what I understand, this is now known science, right? We know how to treat human waste and domestic waste.
Largely, yes.
Largely, right?
We're still looking.
Sure.
But largely.
But this is like the science is at least has been developed over the last 100 odd years.
Yes.
Then why is it so hard? What's the hard part here?
The application of it, the engineering of it, and making sure that systems actually run the way we intend for them to. Because system failure is an absolute real thing, especially as we come down the scale. When it comes to larger scales, you anticipate that they're built as really sunk costs as large infrastructure projects. I mean, if you look at a centralized sewage treatment plant, it covers acres of land, right? And it's run by the government. You have people who know how to design it, how to run it. At least they're in the beginning of the startup phase of the STP itself.
Okay.
When as you go down the scale, it becomes complicated also because of a lot of variation in the load itself, right? Sometimes you have peak flows in the mornings and the nights, so you need to have tanks to stabilize that flow. You also have, say, like we mentioned earlier, you have unintended or unwanted substances coming into your
Right.
pipes itself.
Hmm.
So stuff like pads or condoms that could, if in bulk, could really end up choking your screens. So
Okay.
maintenance, operations, making sure that your machinery, your pumps, your valves, they all undergo preventive maintenance as opposed to, when an issue comes up, then we look at it.
Right.
So all of these issues in actually making sure an STP runs. And if you're looking at aerobic systems, then having continuous supply of electricity. So either you have from, say, something like BESCOM, or you have a DG generator on site, because it's a lot of requirement of power, right?
Go through them a little bit one by one for me, because again, it seems overwhelming, but you're saying the science is known, but design and implementation's hard. But even there, can you tell me a little bit of how mature is the technology of sewage treatment plants? Are we still tinkering and figuring things out, or do we know how to design and build one?
It's an interesting question, right? Because the activated sludge process, something that we commonly use, that's 100 years old. And
Okay.
we've been using modifications of that as we've implemented them at scale. So usually even the sewerage or STPs would come up at, say, a subcity or a neighborhood. It's sometimes if you're looking at a smaller place at a city level. And that is well known. You have established companies who work in that space, who know how to design and operate them. And they're fairly doing, they're doing a good,
Okay, so
an okay job. They're doing
okay.
a good job.
So they know how to do it. One question is, but they know how to do it, but is it affordable, inexpensive, or does it still take money?
No, sewage treatment takes up a lot of money. Like I said, it's cost in construction itself to begin with. It's land costs, it's personnel and chemicals, equipment costs. So it is a very, money.
So you
moving-
can't build and forget.
You cannot.
Okay. So one part is we know how to build some of these larger ones. We have some standardized designs and so on, and we have capable professionals, but the money is not always there. Or money is there at some points.
Yeah.
Dear viewer, if you're liking the Well Lab show so far, you may also like the Water Data podcast with my colleague Veena Srinivasan. Veena is an award-winning water researcher and thinker and talks to some of the top minds in the world on everything water. You can find all episodes of the Water Data podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I mean, we have this conversation in India to pay for water, and we struggle to. And now we are saying, no, pay for your treatment of your wastewater. And clearly,
Yeah.
people don't want to. And that's the thing, right? You might have a right to water at one end. You don't have the right to release polluted water into the world. But
No.
it has become a right? I have the right to have a sewage connection and then just let it out and forget about it, right? And not.
But we also have, I think, referring to, I think, one of your older conversations, which I would concur with, the responsibility to treat our wastewater or our used water, really. And like I said, it works at the larger scales also because economies of scale that sort of kicks in there. But as you go more and more decentralized, and right now we're even looking at solutions at the toilet level itself.
Okay.
There, the science is constantly evolving uh, because of the nature of the incoming influent itself.
Okay.
Right. And you also have different requirements. Now, what a large STP is supposed to do, which is treat your nutrients, a smaller one is also supposed to do it. But is it able to do it? Does it even have the land required to be able to have these tanks spaced out as they should be? Can it give it the time, which we call retention time, in each of these tanks for the processes to be complete?
Okay.
You know,
So you're saying the incoming sort of untreated wastewater needs to sit for long enough for the digestion for the
yeah,
stuff to happen.
yeah.
Okay.
So these still remain as questions, and I think these still remain as places where we might want
So,
to go a little
so if
deeper.
the larger sewage treatment plants are a more solved thing, then isn't that then the solution? Like, why are we even bothering with apartment level sewage treatment plants then?
As we know, utilities really come later as opposed to people settling in places. So a lot of it really is unsewered, right? So we're looking at non-sewered sanitation here, where you have people living there for multiple years, even decades, before the sewer line comes in, and you can't keep going around polluting your own groundwater, your soil, just because the municipality isn't here. And laying down pipes, the pipes themselves and the whole activity of laying them down is super expensive.
So these are the sort of sewerage networks, the underground, the UGD that is there. So that costs quite a bit and not
Yeah.
just the sewage treatment plant again.
Yes.
So the apartment level sewage treatment plants are the smaller ones. You're saying, yes, the technology is evolving. We have reinvented the toilet, other things that have happened globally or are happening. But you're saying what? The designs are not standardized for apartments or?
So the designs aren't. They're really built by builders who, for them, is a cost to construction. And they tend to build systems that they don't really have to run.
Right.
So it's not optimized for the things that the system is supposed to do, really.
Okay. So one thing you mentioned was things not staying in tanks long enough for them to digest. So Deepthi, can you tell me a little more about what is not working in practice at these smaller sewage treatment plants that are sort of needed and that are actively there in a city like mine?
So a lot of the times we also look at how much sewage is incoming and whether or not the STP is able to take that volume of water that's coming in. Sometimes what happens is that either it's under designed or it's under capacity or it's over designed. Say for example, you have some measures of water saving that's happening upstream or at the user end, and that means you have lesser and lesser volumes of water that's coming in. So you have to consider the water itself that's coming in from the point of generation to when it enters the tank. Again, the issue of choking, of screens not functioning well, the issue of, say, for example, the creation of dead zones even within the reactor tank itself because your aerator or the air doesn't reach every part of the tank.
This is one thing I realized again in college. I had to do a tiny bit of chemical engineering and I really, really hated it. But one thing that made me realize is that in a test tube, you can mix everything well, or in a laboratory setting, just the simple act of mixing a few things is trivial, right? You shake them around, you do whatever. But the idea that in a large system, that's where the engineering comes in. That's why it's not a laboratory thing of just stirring a tank which has, I don't know, 50,000 liters
Yeah,
is a hard thing.
it is.
And like just getting oxygen to that entire tank needs effort.
It
And
does. It requires, of course, energy in terms of electricity. It requires forethought to put in certain kinds of aerators in different types of tanks. So you have coarse aeration, fine aeration. It also means that you
as in like size of bubbles and so
size
on?
of bubbles, yes.
Huh. Okay.
It also means that you take into account that there are some zones which could end up dead. I mean, that's also what we know. So then how do you maintain the tanks in such an environment? It also means that you give enough settling time so that your filters don't get choked because otherwise you still have particles that could have been settled coming in which are a higher particle size, which then end up just fouling your filter media essentially.
So you mean this is such a complex system where if you have one point of failure somewhere, it flows down the
Yeah.
and you have to do all of this troubleshooting of any problems while there is more
Yes.
poop and pee and other things flowing in.
Constant. Yeah.
So that's coming in, but you have to
Yeah.
fix this.
You do.
Which means you need someone who knows how to fix it.
Absolutely.
Which means we have to pay for someone to. So is it then fair to say that if we are putting enough money on it, we can manage our sewage? Is this a money at one level? A money question?
At one level it is.
Okay.
But that's also not the only.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's intent. Do we want to do it?
Also, people who are skilled to operate these systems.
Right.
Designers who are thinking of what the problem that particular STP or that form of those kinds of STPs at, say, malls as opposed to residential units are there to solve, which is not in place. Designing is an aspect of it, but really the crux of it is in the operations and how well the system is maintained.
Mm. And it also means then that at whatever scale, you also need to be able to see when things are going wrong, right?
Absolutely, you need
So,
checks in place. So you need people who are able to then come in at the right time to troubleshoot it. Maybe your operator who's there on site, might not have the same knowledge as a plumber who's able to then fix things. Even at the last point, right, which is really crucial to ensure that the water is safe, chlorination or the amount of chlorine dosed becomes important. Maintaining a residual concentration becomes important. It's not a do it once and forget. It's make sure that the water remains at the quality at which you intend for it to either be reused or to be released into the environment.
so if you just want to save even like a little bit of electricity or a little bit of your chemical costs, those small differences can have large consequences.
They can.
So it's not very linear that, oh, I'm treating to 100%, I'll make it 90%, so I'll have 90% of outcome. But the things can change dramatically.
They can.
Okay.
And because they're largely biological systems, you really need to be able to work with these microbes, right? There is a startup phase. There is a phase where they're still growing. So then you might have to bring in inoculum or microbes from another STP to make sure you have enough mass in yours. So
So this is like
troubleshooting,
what we do with curds and like,
yeah.
okay, you have to do that with an STP. Wonderful.
So troubleshooting an STP is really working with the microbe.
Okay. And all of this currently happens in some dank basement, which nobody wants to think about, nobody wants to talk about, or in some corner of your apartment complex, or even into a city level, some corner of the city that none of us want to interact with in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And we want all of this to happen.
I mean, for whoever's listening, if you know where your STP is located, I'd call you pretty aware as a person in an
That's
apartment.
right. I'm not actually sure where my household wouldn't go to either, so I'll try and find out. Deepthi, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to continue this conversation, I think, where we talk about, okay, how are individual sewage treatment plants designed, what kinds of designs, what kind of technologies have what kind of benefits or challenges. But I think it was important for us to lay a bit of the groundwork on the science. And the moment somebody talks about, oh, this is a phosphorus limiting environment, that I don't fully check out and like not get a sense of what's happening at all. Deepthi, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Pavan. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Well Labs Show. Don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Until next time.